All right, welcome to week 6. This week we again are looking at civil rights. And civil rights are protections by the government to people who have been historically denied rights. And there's a fairly broad category of folks who, legally speaking, have been subject to discrimination and as a result have claims on the government for civil rights. So this week we want you to be able to outline the legal developments and social movements that affected civil rights. We want you to be able to explain how the courts have evaluated recent civil rights concerns and challenges and controversies. And we want you to be able to explain the key Supreme Court decisions on affirmative action. We should always keep in mind that the Supreme Court plays an incredibly central role in terms of understanding how our Constitution is applied and how the scope of our liberties and the scope of our rights. Woodrow Wilson, the only president who was ever a political scientist, once said, "The Supreme Court is a constitutional convention in continuous session." And by that, he basically meant that the Supreme Court is uniquely situated to be able to say, whether gay and lesbian couples can get married, whether former felons can vote. These are all things that at least potentially lie within the scope of the Supreme Court. At the start of the text, it talks about Desmond Meade, guy who had been in the Army, he'd gotten out, he'd had some problems, been convicted of a couple of crimes. When he got out, he went through a near, kind of suicide situation, and then he decided to, change his life. So he went to school, he earned a law degree, but in Florida he couldn't practice law because he couldn't take the bar exam. Florida's Constitution basically says that if you've been convicted of a felony, you can't vote and you can't, seek to pass the bar. So Florida is one of 4 such states that have lifetime voting bans for felons. Meade helped organize the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, the FRRC, and they started a petition drive. They ran a campaign, and in November 2018, which again was a midterm election year, they got a ballot, they got an initiative on the ballot to restore Florida felons' voting rights. And Amendment 4 ultimately earns more than 64% of the vote, which it needed a 60% threshold in order to change the Constitution. That appeared to give Florida's 774,000 disfranchised felons the right to vote. Let that sink in for a moment. Florida has more felons than Oklahoma has citizens. Okay, that's a lot of former felons. Now, Florida's legislature had other ideas. In 2019, after that successful ballot initiative, they passed a bill basically saying that if you were a felon, in order to get your right to vote back, you had to pay all court fees and all fines. Now, that sounds right. I mean, that sounds reasonable. But there was this thing called disparate impact. Consistently, Black and Hispanic, former felons, first of all, couldn't find out whether they had any fines or court fees. And overwhelmingly, white felons were somehow able to identify and to pay off their fines. And so this provoked a lot of outside groups to begin, to try and help felons out, to pay their financial penalties. Of course, this is happening in the midst of a campaign season, so everyone gets fired up about it, heading into the 2020 elections. Part of the problem with identifying who has a fine and who, has outstanding costs is that Florida doesn't have a centralized, publicly available database to identify fines, which is something that if you're going to impose that kind of additional penalty, you should probably, have that sort of resource available. In 2020, federal district judge Robert Hinkle struck the law down on the grounds that Florida's legislature had effectively imposed a poll tax on felons, which again, there was an amendment to the Constitution that banned poll taxes. And so this was one of the things that they basically did to make this argument again, that felons should have a right to vote. So what does this tell us about civil rights. First and foremost, the idea that civil liberties protects us means the analog, that civil rights effectively means that government has in some ways failed to protect some category of people who have been subject to discrimination or to other forms of abuse. So civil rights reflect actions governments must undertake in two ways. Governments must provide equal protection under the law, under the 14th Amendment. And two, governments must take action to reverse or ameliorate past discrimination. In other words, to hold harmless categories of people who have been systematically subject to discriminate. So civil rights regulates issues related to participation. Who can vote, who can serve on juries, and when and how can citizens petition the government to act. Civil rights is the essence of how Americans protect minority rights and the rights of women who are not minorities. And so this is a really important chapter. And of course, this is part of what has, this is one set of issues that has become really polarizing in recent years. A lot of Americans fundamentally reject the notion that the government has any obligation to do anything positively towards other people. They reject the idea that there is discrimination and basically argue that the government's sole role is to protect private property and to ensure public order. Liberals and Democrats basically have a fundamentally different argument that once people have been subject to discrimination, they are also then subject to intimidation, and that what government should be doing more to protect people from those kinds of abuses. So as always, when you encounter things in this text, in this chapter that you don't get, please ask me a question. I'm happy to answer it, happy to engage with you. I want to keep the engagement positive and friendly. I'm always, again, happy to debate issues. I don't debate it. I don't take these things personally. I simply want you to have the best understanding of this material that you can. So again, don't be afraid to take me on. I'm not going to hold it against you. So let's have a great week.